Rain gathers slowly along the wooden platform outside the station long before dawn. The lamps above the tracks burn with a weak amber glow that barely reaches the wet pavement below, and the air smells faintly of coal smoke drifting across the harbor from somewhere beyond the warehouses. Men stand beneath heavy coats without speaking very much. A suitcase closes with a dull metallic click. Farther down the platform, a soldier folds a newspaper beneath his arm while steam breathes softly from the locomotive waiting in the dark. The war has already crossed the ocean by now, though here the morning still resembles ordinary life closely enough that people continue pretending not to notice the difference. The train windows hold pale reflections instead of faces. Some carry young men toward camps surrounded by fences and guard towers. Others carry them toward military schools hidden deeper inland, where instructors wait beside blackboards covered in Japanese characters written carefully in white chalk. Nothing about the station explains which destination belongs to whom. The uncertainty settles quietly into the cold air between departures. Shoes scrape against wet timber. A whistle sounds somewhere farther down the line. No one raises their voice above the weather. Inside one coat pocket rests a folded photograph already softening at the corners. A mother standing beside a garden fence before the evacuation orders came. Two younger sisters trying not to smile too seriously for the camera. Behind them, laundry hangs beneath California sunlight that now feels impossibly distant from this gray morning station. The photograph remains hidden most of the time. Not because it is forbidden, but because memory has begun changing shape under pressure. Things once simple now require explanation. Even ordinary names move carefully through conversations. You watch the platform disappear slowly behind drifting steam as the train begins moving eastward through the rain. Telephone poles slide past the windows one after another in steady rhythm. Farms emerge briefly from the darkness before dissolving again beneath low cloud and fog. Somewhere ahead waits a country asking young Japanese-American men to prove loyalty through language. The request carries a strange weight. Their parents taught them many of these words quietly at kitchen tables years earlier, never imagining those same syllables would one day travel through interrogation tents, jungle radios, battlefield leaflets, or surrender broadcasts beneath foreign skies. At first the war still feels distant enough to remain abstract. Newspapers describe islands most Americans have never seen. Military officials speak in maps and shipping lanes. But distance begins shrinking inside ordinary routines. Barbershops fall silent when certain customers enter. Grocery clerks avoid eye contact a little too carefully. Neighbors who once exchanged gardening advice now pull curtains closed at night. Fear changes slowly in democratic countries. It rarely arrives all at once. More often it settles gradually into tone of voice, into paperwork, into hesitation. The train rocks gently through the darkness while the passengers drift in and out of exhausted sleep. One young man keeps rehearsing Japanese military ranks beneath his breath almost silently, fingers moving against his knee as though counting invisible beads. Another stares through the glass at telephone wires rising and falling beside the tracks. Across the aisle, an army sergeant snores softly with his cap tilted forward over his eyes. The carriage smells of damp wool, tobacco smoke, and coffee carried aboard hours earlier before the station disappeared behind them. Outside, dawn struggles slowly upward beneath heavy cloud. Fields brighten first. Then barns. Then narrow rivers carrying pale strips of reflected sky between frozen banks. The country appears calm from this distance. Empty roads. Quiet fences. Winter trees standing motionless beside the tracks. Yet somewhere beneath that stillness, entire communities are already being rearranged. Families packed into temporary barracks. Businesses abandoned. Names recorded on lists. Loyalty measured through suspicion before service has even begun. The war has not yet reached the beaches where many of these men will eventually work beneath artillery smoke and tropical rain. It has not yet reached the caves where frightened soldiers whisper surrender pleas through trembling voices. It has not yet reached the ruined Japanese cities where interpreters will stand between occupation authorities and civilians searching for missing relatives among the ashes. For now there is only the rhythm of wheels against rails and the uneasy feeling of traveling toward a future that remains undefined even to the men commanding it. The train continues east through the morning fog while the country wakes slowly around it. Small stations appear and vanish. Factory chimneys release smoke into low winter skies. Somewhere beyond the windows, church bells begin ringing faintly across a distant town. The sound fades almost immediately beneath the engine's steady breathing. And still the train moves on. Before the first transport ships carry them westward across the Pacific, before jungle humidity swallows the smell of these classrooms forever, stay here a moment longer in the quiet light beside the windows and take a moment to subscribe, but only if these calm journeys through history help you rest, reflect, and drift more deeply into the forgotten corners of the past. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment lingers beside you the longest tonight. By the time the train reaches the interior of the country, the weather has hardened into sleet. Ice gathers in pale lines along the corners of the windows, and the farmland beyond the tracks has flattened into long stretches of winter earth interrupted only by telephone poles and dark rows of trees. The passengers speak less now. Morning conversation has given way to fatigue, and fatigue slowly changes the atmosphere inside the carriage. Coffee cups sit empty beside folded newspapers. Boots rest against canvas duffel bags marked with army numbers already beginning to smear beneath moisture and travel. The language school waits beyond a small town surrounded by frozen fields and military fencing. From a distance, the buildings resemble an ordinary college campus abandoned for the winter, but closer inspection reveals sentries beside the gates and blackout curtains hanging behind many of the windows. Snowmelt drips steadily from the roofs. Somewhere nearby, a truck engine coughs into life before fading again into silence. Men step down from the train stiffly, shoulders hunched against the cold, while instructors carrying clipboards check names beneath the pale grey sky. Inside the classrooms, the war becomes quieter and more exact. Chalk dust settles over wooden desks scarred by generations of earlier students. Japanese newspapers lie spread beside military manuals already worn soft from handling. The instructors move carefully through dialects, honorifics, naval terminology, artillery phrases, and handwriting styles difficult even for fluent readers to untangle. Certain kanji characters receive entire afternoons of attention. A single mistranslated phrase might someday redirect artillery, misread troop movement, or alter the meaning of surrender instructions shouted through jungle loudspeakers beneath enemy fire. The work repeats itself hour after hour with exhausting patience. Pencil against paper. Erasure. Repetition. Verification. Outside the windows, snow drifts slowly across the parade grounds while army trucks leave dark tracks through slush and ice. At night, lamps continue glowing inside the classrooms long after the barracks have quieted. Some students whisper vocabulary to themselves while shaving in the mornings. Others fall asleep over dictionaries with their glasses still on. The war has not yet become violent here. It has become procedural. You watch the routine settle over the school the way winter settles over the surrounding fields. Morning roll call. Translation drills. Mess hall coffee served in metal cups too hot to hold comfortably. The same boots crossing the same corridors before sunrise each day. Yet beneath the repetition lives a pressure difficult to explain aloud. Many of the men studying here grew up hearing Japanese spoken softly at dinner tables beside American radios broadcasting baseball games and election results. Now those same childhood sounds are being reorganized into military instruments. Some of the instructors understand the contradiction intimately. They correct grammar with calm precision while knowing their own relatives remain behind fences elsewhere in the country. Internment camps stretch across deserts and isolated valleys far from these snow-covered classrooms. Tar paper barracks. Dust storms. Guard towers standing against empty skies. Letters arrive slowly from mothers describing weather, shortages, illnesses, and gardens that could not be brought along. Students read the letters privately before folding them away again beneath blankets or inside lockers beside army-issued wool uniforms. The contradiction is never discussed directly for very long. Military institutions prefer movement over reflection. There are schedules to maintain, tests to administer, documents to process. Yet silence itself becomes part of the atmosphere. A young interpreter may spend the afternoon translating Japanese troop communications before returning to a barracks room where another soldier quietly rereads a letter from family still confined behind wire in Arizona or Wyoming. The emotional distance between service and suspicion begins stretching wider than language can comfortably bridge. Weeks pass. Then months. Winter slowly loosens its grip on the roads surrounding the school. Snowbanks collapse into muddy water beneath weak spring sunlight. Birds return to telephone wires beside the training grounds. New shipments of captured documents arrive for translation practice, still carrying stains from Pacific humidity and salt air. The distant war grows gradually more physical through paper alone. Mud pressed into boot prints. Sweat marks on field orders. Crude maps folded and unfolded until the corners tear away. The interpreters begin learning not only vocabulary, but rhythm. How exhausted soldiers shorten phrases beneath pressure. How officers disguise fear beneath formal language. How surrender leaflets must sound persuasive without sounding insulting. Entire nights disappear into discussions over tone. One badly chosen word might convince frightened enemy soldiers that surrender means execution. Another might persuade civilians to emerge safely from caves instead of remaining hidden beneath bombardment. Meaning becomes fragile. Human lives begin attaching themselves to grammar. Outside the classrooms, America continues moving through wartime routines of ration books, factory whistles, blackout drills, and newspaper headlines. But here inside the school, the war narrows into smaller observations. Ink drying beneath lamplight. Fingertips stained dark from carbon paper. The soft turning of dictionary pages after midnight. Rain tapping steadily against barracks windows during spring storms while translators memorize military phrases they hope never to hear spoken directly toward them. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing the exact moment it happens, the students stop feeling like civilians temporarily wearing uniforms. The institution reshapes posture first. Then routine. Then silence. Their labor begins binding them to a war that increasingly depends upon voices, meanings, and interpretation as much as rifles or artillery. The barracks beyond the fence. Spring rain settles softly into the dust roads outside the assembly center, turning the ground dark beneath rows of barracks that seem to stretch farther each morning. Water gathers along shallow drainage ditches beside the fences, reflecting pale strips of cloud drifting slowly overhead. The buildings themselves look temporary in a way that never feels comforting. Thin wooden walls. Tar paper roofs. Gaps beneath doors where wind carries dust inside during dry afternoons and cold air during the night. Laundry hangs between poles behind the barracks, moving gently in the damp breeze while somewhere beyond the wire a freight train sounds its horn across the valley. The families wake early because privacy has become difficult. Doors open and close constantly along the narrow walkways between buildings. Children carry metal buckets toward communal washrooms while older men stand outside smoking quietly before breakfast. From a distance, the camp resembles a work site more than a prison. That resemblance matters. The government prefers practical appearances. Guard towers remain visible but not dominant. Soldiers patrol slowly without speaking much. Official signs describe relocation and protection. Yet the fences remain fences regardless of the language attached to them. Inside one barracks room, a mother folds blankets carefully over army cots while listening to rain strike the roof above her. The sound changes depending on weather. During light rain, it resembles fingers drumming softly against paper. During storms, the entire structure rattles with hollow vibration strong enough to wake sleeping children after midnight. Small domestic routines survive stubbornly beneath those sounds. Rice steaming over portable hot plates. Shoes lined neatly beside beds. Family photographs pinned against unfinished wood walls that still smell faintly of fresh lumber and desert dust. You watch the camp settle into repetition the way towns settle around factories or harbors. Breakfast lines before sunrise. Medical inspections. Roll calls. Long afternoons interrupted only by wind and announcements echoing through loudspeakers mounted on poles near the administration buildings. Certain habits become automatic with surprising speed. People stop looking toward the fences each time guards pass. Children invent games using scraps of wood or flattened cans. Older residents begin discussing weather more often because weather remains one of the few subjects untouched by politics. But beneath the routine rests a quieter uncertainty difficult to exhaust through familiarity. Nobody knows how long ordinary life will remain suspended here. Rumors move constantly between barracks. Someone heard families may be relocated deeper inland. Someone else heard loyal citizens will soon be released. Another claims military recruiters are searching for Japanese-American volunteers willing to serve despite the confinement of their relatives. Each version travels across the camp with slight alterations before dissolving into uncertainty again. The young men hear these rumors differently than their parents do. Many were born in the United States. They attended American schools, memorized American state capitals, played baseball beneath American flags hanging above gymnasiums and assembly halls. Yet after Pearl Harbor, the categories surrounding them shifted abruptly. Citizenship no longer carried the same certainty it once had. Now loyalty exists as something requiring performance. Documentation. Endorsement. Visible proof. At first, the possibility of military service produces confusion more than patriotism. Some reject the idea entirely. Others volunteer immediately, desperate to escape the stagnation of the camps or reclaim a sense of belonging that confinement has damaged. Many remain undecided for weeks. The emotional terrain becomes uneven inside families. Fathers who once encouraged quiet obedience now argue over dinner tables about honor and humiliation. Mothers fold laundry while pretending not to hear the disagreements. Younger sisters listen silently from nearby cots while rain taps against the roofs overhead. One afternoon, notices appear near the mess halls requesting Japanese speakers for specialized military language programs. The papers themselves look ordinary enough. Thin government forms pinned beside announcements about rationing and medical schedules. Yet small crowds gather around them almost immediately. Men stand reading without speaking. Some already know enough Japanese to qualify because their parents insisted on language lessons years earlier. Others understand only fragments. A few deliberately avoided speaking Japanese while growing up, hoping fluency in English alone would make them less vulnerable in America. The irony settles slowly over the camp after the notices appear. A language once treated with suspicion has suddenly acquired military value. Parents who spent years worrying their children would become too American now watch the army reward fragments of Japanese culture the country recently condemned. Certain mothers begin encouraging sons to volunteer because translation work sounds safer than infantry combat. Others distrust the offer entirely. Government priorities change quickly during wars. Fear changes quickly too. Evening arrives gradually beneath thickening cloud. Lamps flicker on inside the barracks one by one while cooking smells drift through damp air between the buildings. Somewhere nearby, a radio broadcasts distant swing music muffled by rain and static. A boy rides a bicycle slowly beside the fence before a guard motions him away from the perimeter with weary impatience. Beyond the wire, farmland stretches outward beneath fading light as though ordinary America still waits patiently just beyond reach. Inside many barracks, conversations continue late into the night after children fall asleep. Some families discuss enlistment quietly beside dim lamps while wind presses against the thin walls. Others avoid the subject entirely. Certain fathers insist that serving the country may restore dignity stolen by confinement. Others argue that loyalty should not require sacrifice from citizens already imprisoned without trial. No resolution arrives before sleep. Only exhaustion. Farther away, beyond the camps and inland valleys, the language schools continue expanding quietly beneath military authority. More classrooms. More instructors. More intercepted documents arriving from the Pacific. The war is growing larger than the institutions built to manage it. Somewhere inside Washington offices, intelligence officers realize that victory may depend partly upon young men currently sleeping tonight inside American detention camps beneath rain-soaked roofs. And still the rain continues falling across the barracks through the dark. Morning arrives beneath low fog that settles against the fences and guard towers until the entire camp seems suspended inside a pale gray haze. The mountains beyond the valley disappear completely for several hours after sunrise, leaving only wet earth, dripping roofs, and rows of identical barracks fading softly into mist. Water slides from the corners of the buildings in steady rhythm. Somewhere near the mess hall, a generator hums unevenly before catching properly with a rough metallic cough. The camp always feels smaller during weather like this. Sound does not travel as far through fog. Conversations remain close to the ground. Footsteps emerge suddenly from whiteness and disappear again almost immediately. Men walk toward administrative buildings carrying folders of paperwork beneath their coats while soldiers at the gates stamp their boots against the cold mud. Nothing dramatic occurs. That is part of the pressure. The days rarely announce themselves through spectacle. More often they accumulate through repetition until entire months seem constructed from weather, waiting, and uncertainty layered carefully together. The recruitment process advances slowly enough to feel almost accidental. Interviews first. Then language evaluations. Then forms measuring loyalty through questions written in careful bureaucratic phrasing. Certain questions spread through the camp faster than official announcements themselves. Would you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States? Would you forswear loyalty to the Japanese emperor? The wording unsettles many families immediately. Nisei parents, barred by law from becoming American citizens for most of their lives, cannot fully answer questions built upon citizenship they were never allowed to possess. Inside the barracks, people begin discussing language differently now. Not poetry or childhood memory, but utility. Mothers correct pronunciation at dinner tables. Fathers reopen forgotten schoolbooks stored at the bottoms of trunks since before the war. Some young men sit outside after evening meals repeating military vocabulary beneath their breath while dust drifts across the walkways in the dry spring wind. The camp itself begins producing interpreters almost unconsciously, reshaping private inheritance into military preparation. You watch the transformation occur through small details long before official departure orders arrive. Army-issued notebooks appear beside family photographs. Haircuts become shorter. Posture changes slightly during morning inspections. Men who once wandered the camp aimlessly after lunch now spend hours practicing written characters inside crowded recreation halls converted into temporary study rooms. One room smells constantly of damp wool uniforms and pencil shavings. Another carries the dry scent of overheated radiators and old paper. The atmosphere resembles examination season at a university more than preparation for war. Yet the fences remain visible through every classroom window. That contradiction settles heavily into ordinary routine. Young men preparing to serve the United States still return each evening to barracks guarded by American soldiers. Mothers sewing name tags onto military clothing still stand in ration lines beneath watchtowers. The emotional strain rarely erupts openly because the camp has already trained people into restraint. Anger consumes too much energy in places built around waiting. Instead, the pressure moves inward, becoming quieter and more enduring. Certain evenings bring dust storms rolling across the valley without warning. Fine grit enters through cracks in the barracks walls and settles across blankets, dishes, books, and skin. During those storms, the camp sounds different. Wind presses against the roofs with a long dry roar while doors rattle violently in their frames. Families stuff towels beneath thresholds to keep sand from covering the floors. Children cough through the night. Lamps flicker behind curtains glowing dimly through airborne dust. On one such evening, a young man sits beside a small table copying Japanese characters repeatedly onto lined paper while his younger sister sleeps nearby beneath extra blankets against the cold. His father smokes silently near the door, listening to the storm scrape against the walls. Neither speaks for a long time. Finally, the father asks him to repeat a phrase aloud from the notebook. The son hesitates slightly before answering in careful Japanese, his accent carrying traces of California classrooms beneath the older rhythms of his parents' speech. The father nods once and says nothing more. Outside, the storm continues crossing the valley beneath guard tower lights that glow faintly through blowing dust. Somewhere beyond the camp perimeter, freight trains carry military supplies westward toward Pacific ports. Fuel, ammunition, medical equipment. The scale of the war expands constantly, swallowing ships, islands, factories, and entire coastlines into its machinery. But here inside the camp, the war still expresses itself through paperwork, fences, vocabulary drills, and the quiet shame of needing permission to prove loyalty. Weeks later, the first departure orders finally arrive. The atmosphere changes immediately, though almost nothing visible changes at first. Barracks remain standing beneath the same weathered roofs. Breakfast lines still form before sunrise. Guards continue pacing beside the fences with practiced boredom. Yet underneath the routine, a new tension begins moving through the camp. Suitcases reappear beneath bunks. Families discuss train schedules after dark. Certain mothers begin cooking favorite meals whenever ingredients can be obtained through ration systems already stretched thin by war. The departures themselves happen quietly. No marching bands. No speeches large enough to transform the mood. Usually only buses waiting near administrative buildings before dawn while families gather nearby carrying blankets, thermoses, and parcels wrapped carefully in cloth. The men boarding those buses do not yet resemble heroes or veterans. Most still look like students interrupted midway through ordinary life. You watch mothers straighten coat collars one final time before stepping back into the cold morning air. Fathers shake hands because prolonged emotion feels dangerous in public places. Younger brothers stare silently at army boots climbing bus steps slick with rainwater. The engines start slowly, coughing exhaust into the pale light while military police checklists beside the road. Then the buses pull away from the camp. And for several moments afterward, nobody moves very much at all. Rooms filled with paper. The buses arrive at the language school before sunrise beneath skies still carrying the last grey weight of winter. Frost clings to the edges of the parade grounds, and the buildings stand motionless in the cold like empty administrative offices waiting for occupants who have not yet fully arrived in their own lives. Steam drifts upward from vents along the rooftops. Somewhere behind the classrooms, a truck reverses slowly through slush while chains rattle faintly against frozen pavement. The men step down carrying duffel bags damp from travel and pause instinctively to study the place that will now reshape them. Nothing about the school appears dramatic from the outside. Long rectangular buildings. Barracks painted in dull military colors already beginning to fade beneath weather. Utility poles carrying wires across muddy roads between classrooms and administration offices. Yet inside these ordinary structures the Pacific War has begun condensing into documents, maps, intercepted transmissions, and fragments of language gathered from battlefields thousands of kilometers away. The war arrives here first through paper. The classrooms smell of chalk dust, wet wool, and overheated radiators. Rows of desks face blackboards crowded with Japanese characters written in rapid strokes that seem almost alive beneath the white chalk. Instructors move through the rooms with the restrained urgency of men aware that the war is advancing faster than their students can realistically be prepared for it. There are never enough translators. Never enough interpreters. Never enough hours to teach what the Pacific will soon demand. Morning lessons begin before the frost fully disappears from the windows. Naval terminology first. Then military abbreviations. Then regional dialects difficult even for fluent speakers to follow clearly under stress. Some students understand formal Japanese but struggle with handwritten field notes recovered from dead soldiers in jungle positions. Others speak conversationally with ease yet falter when translating artillery reports or coded logistics messages. Entire afternoons disappear into the interpretation of single pages. You watch the instructors work patiently through confusion that no dictionary can fully resolve. A phrase may change meaning depending upon rank, region, exhaustion, or fear. One intercepted message from a retreating officer carries formal language collapsing gradually into fragmented shorthand near the end, as though the writer abandoned discipline while shells fell nearby. Another document appears straightforward until an instructor explains that certain expressions conceal references understood only inside particular military units. Meaning hides itself constantly inside culture. Outside, spring rain returns again and again throughout the weeks that follow. Water darkens the parade grounds and pools beside the barracks while students hurry between buildings carrying stacks of notebooks beneath their coats. The weather becomes part of the routine. Damp uniforms hanging beside heaters after evening drills. Mud drying on boots outside classroom doors. The smell of rain mixing with cigarette smoke during short breaks between lectures. The war remains distant geographically, but physically the school begins absorbing its atmosphere through exhaustion alone. At night the classrooms glow long after sunset. Lamps burn above translation tables covered in captured diaries, field maps, and military manuals spread open beneath rulers and pencils. Certain pages still carry stains from tropical rainwater or dirt pressed into the folds. Some documents smell faintly of mildew from months spent inside jungle packs before being recovered by American patrols. Students handle these papers carefully because the objects themselves feel strangely intimate. Someone carried this notebook through fear, hunger, retreat, or boredom before abandoning it in mud beside a battlefield river or cave entrance. The work changes the students slowly. At first, many still speak like civilians temporarily passing through military life. They joke during meals. They complain about schedules and weather. They write long letters home describing instructors, food, and sleeping conditions. But repetition begins sanding away parts of ordinary identity. Days narrow into translation drills, intelligence reports, memorization, and testing. Certain men start dreaming in fragmented combinations of Japanese and English military phrases. Others wake suddenly at night, convinced they have mistranslated something important during evening exercises. Some instructors encourage relentless precision almost to the point of cruelty. A single mistaken character may trigger an hour-long correction session before the entire class. Yet even the harshest instructors understand the pressure shaping the school. News from the Pacific grows steadily worse during these months. Island campaigns expand across maps pinned inside briefing rooms. Casualty reports arrive faster than replacement personnel can be trained. Intelligence failures cost ships, airfields, and lives. Every corrected mistake inside these classrooms carries invisible urgency behind it. You begin noticing how silence functions differently here than it did inside the camps. There, silence protected dignity. Here, silence concentrates attention. Men sit beneath weak electric lights turning pages slowly while rain taps against the windows after midnight. Occasionally, someone mutters a translation aloud before crossing it out again. The atmosphere feels less like a military academy than a monastery devoted entirely to interpretation. Yet beneath the discipline, another tension remains alive. Some students still receive letters from families living behind fences farther west. Mothers describing dust storms inside camp barracks. Fathers writing briefly about illness or shortages without complaint. Younger siblings asking when the war will finally end so everyone can go home again. The contrast becomes difficult to escape. During the day, these men study Japanese military communication for the United States Army. At night, they unfold letters stamped by censorship offices and read about American detention camps holding their families indefinitely. The contradiction rarely receives direct discussion inside the classrooms. Military institutions survive by compartmentalization. One room teaches loyalty through service. Another processes reports from camps guarded by American soldiers. The students learn quickly that emotional complexity slows instruction. So most continue working quietly beneath the lamps while spring storms move across the parade grounds outside. And still the stacks of intercepted paper continue growing higher. By early summer, the school no longer feels temporary to the men living inside it. The routines have settled too deeply into the body. Boots strike the corridors before sunrise with automatic rhythm. Hands reach for notebooks before full wakefulness arrives. Even the smell of the buildings, damp paper, floor polish, radiator heat, cigarette smoke trapped inside wool fabric, begins carrying the strange familiarity of home. The institution reshapes people gradually through repetition rather than command. Morning fog drifts low across the training grounds while bugles echo faintly between the barracks. Trucks arrive carrying new bundles of captured material wrapped in canvas and tied with military cord. Some come from islands whose names the students only recently learned to pronounce correctly. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. The Pacific advances through the school not as geography, but as accumulation. More documents. More urgency. More dead soldiers leaving handwriting behind them. Inside one classroom, an instructor unfolds a map recovered from a ruined Japanese command post. Mud still clings to the corners despite careful cleaning. Tiny handwritten notes crowd the margins in hurried pencil strokes almost erased by rainwater and handling. The students lean forward instinctively as the instructor begins translating sections aloud, explaining how troop movement, supply shortages, and artillery placement can be reconstructed through fragments that once appeared meaningless. Intelligence work often resembles archaeology more than espionage. Meaning survives in traces. The students learn to study not only words, but pressure. Exhausted handwriting. Abrupt sentence endings. Formal language collapsing into panic. Certain reports from isolated island garrisons become shorter over time, stripped gradually of ceremony as starvation and bombardment intensify. Others maintain rigid politeness even while describing hopeless conditions. The interpreters begin understanding that military language reveals emotional states unintentionally. Fear leaves marks on syntax. Isolation changes rhythm. Hunger alters tone. You watch the men absorb these realizations slowly while summer heat settles over the school buildings. Windows remain open during afternoon classes, allowing warm air and distant engine noise to drift through the corridors. Ceiling fans turn lazily above rows of desks while sweat darkens collars beneath uniforms worn too long between washings. The atmosphere becomes heavier now. Less academic. More operational. Rumors spread that some graduates may soon deploy directly into combat zones rather than remain inside intelligence offices far from the front. The possibility changes conversations almost immediately. At night, the barracks remain louder than before. Men debate assignments while sitting beside open windows, smoking into the humid darkness. Some hope for field work because it promises escape from endless classroom repetition. Others quietly fear deployment but avoid admitting it openly. Many still imagine translator duties as distant from direct violence, though instructors increasingly warn otherwise. Interpreters often move near front lines. Captured documents must be translated quickly. Prisoners interrogated immediately. Surrender attempts negotiated before artillery resumes. The war presses closer each week. One evening, a senior instructor gathers several students around a table scattered with Japanese surrender leaflets printed by American psychological warfare units. The pages are thin and cheaply made, designed for mass distribution across islands where exhausted soldiers hide inside caves or jungle fortifications. The instructor explains that translation alone is insufficient. Tone matters more. The language must sound authoritative without humiliation, compassionate without weakness. Too formal, and frightened soldiers may distrust it. Too aggressive, and they may choose death instead. The room falls quiet while the students study the leaflets beneath yellow lamplight. Many of them understand instinctively why the problem is difficult. Honor occupies language differently depending upon culture, upbringing, and circumstance. A phrase acceptable in California may sound insulting in Okinawa. A direct order from an American officer may fail entirely where an appeal to family obligation succeeds. The interpreters are being trained not merely to translate words, but to navigate emotional terrain shaped by fear, nationalism, shame, and survival. Outside, thunderstorms move across the plains surrounding the school. Rain strikes the roofs heavily enough to interrupt lectures until instructors raise their voices over the noise. Water leaks through old window frames onto classroom floors. The students continue working through the storms almost mechanically now, pencils moving across paper while thunder rolls somewhere beyond the barracks. Entire days disappear beneath translation exercises and weather. Fatigue begins changing the atmosphere in quieter ways as well. Some students develop nervous habits, constantly rubbing ink stains from fingertips, rechecking translations long after completion, whispering unfamiliar terms repeatedly while walking between buildings. Sleep becomes shallow for many of them. The mind struggles to release language after 12 or 14 hours of concentration. Japanese military phrases echo beneath dreams alongside train whistles, classroom bells, and fragments of home remembered imperfectly through exhaustion. Letters from the camps continue arriving. A mother writes about unbearable heat inside the barracks during summer afternoons. Another describes elderly residents collapsing during dust storms. One father includes careful instructions for tending tomato plants once the family eventually returns home, as though ordinary gardening advice might preserve continuity against the pressure of war. The students read these letters privately before returning to classrooms where American officers lecture them on loyalty, duty, and national necessity. No one resolves the contradiction because resolution is impossible inside the moment itself. Instead, the men continue working. Translation after translation. Page after page. Rainfall giving way to heat, then heat giving way to evening storms rolling across the dark parade grounds outside. And gradually the school stops feeling like preparation. It begins feeling like the edge of something already underway. Islands of humidity and paper. The transport ship moves westward beneath low Pacific cloud while salt wind drifts across the deck before sunrise. The ocean appears almost colorless at this hour, stretching outward in long gray folds broken only by the slow rise and fall of escort vessels pacing the convoy nearby. Somewhere below deck, engines vibrate steadily through steel corridors smelling of fuel oil, wet canvas, and machine heat. Men sleep lightly inside crowded compartments where hammocks sway gently with the motion of the sea and ventilation fans struggle against the tropical air already thickening around them. For many of the interpreters, the Pacific reveals itself first through weather rather than combat. Humidity settles into uniforms before land even appears. Paper softens at the edges. Ink smears more easily. Skin remains damp constantly beneath collars and sleeves. The air itself feels heavier than the classrooms left behind inland, as though the ocean carries pressure along with heat. At night, condensation gathers along pipes overhead and drips steadily into metal pans placed beneath leaks that no one bothers repairing anymore. The ships travel for days through alternating fog, rain squalls, and sudden bursts of harsh sunlight reflecting violently from the water. Men gather near railings smoking in silence while staring toward horizons that never seem to move closer. Rumors spread between decks about upcoming assignments. Some interpreters may join marine intelligence sections. Others may work beside army interrogators or naval officers. Certain units specialize in captured documents. Others accompany patrols directly into recently secured territory. The uncertainty follows them across the ocean just as it followed them through the camps and language schools. You watch the routines aboard ship narrow gradually into repetition. Breakfast lines swaying with the movement of the sea. Card games interrupted by sudden rain. Boots drying beside ventilation grates after tropical storms sweep across the convoy. The interpreters continue studying whenever possible, carrying notebooks onto the decks during calm weather or reviewing military phrases inside dim compartments lit by weak yellow bulbs after midnight. The institution still clings to them. Translation remains a discipline even while the ocean stretches endlessly around them. Eventually land emerges through rain haze almost imperceptibly at first. Dark shapes beneath low cloud. Then ridge lines. Then dense jungle climbing steep volcanic slopes toward mist-covered peaks. The islands appear beautiful from a distance in ways that feel deeply unsettling once the men understand what waits beneath the trees. Beaches churned apart by shellfire. Airfields carved from mud and coral. Caves holding wounded soldiers too frightened to surrender. Entire landscapes reorganized around survival. The interpreters disembark into heat that seems to rise directly from the ground itself. Humidity presses against the lungs while trucks carry men inland along roads lined with palm trees shredded by artillery blasts and storms. Rainwater fills shell craters beside the road. Abandoned equipment rusts almost immediately beneath the climate. Somewhere beyond the jungle, artillery sounds intermittently like distant doors slamming shut one after another beneath the clouds. The camps established behind the front lines resemble temporary cities assembled from canvas, mud, and exhaustion. Tents sag beneath rainwater. Supply crates lie stacked beside radio equipment protected under tarps already stained dark with mildew. Generators hum continuously through the night while insects gather around exposed lamps in enormous drifting clouds. Nothing remains dry for very long. Maps curl at the edges. Clothing rots slowly beneath sweat and rain. Even cigarettes soften inside unopened packs. The interpreters quickly discover that battlefield language differs sharply from classroom language. Captured diaries contain slang, abbreviations, regional expressions, and hurried shorthand almost impossible to decipher cleanly. Prisoners speak through fear, dehydration, confusion, or shock. Some refuse entirely. Others alternate unpredictably between defiance and collapse. Translation becomes slower here because survival surrounds every conversation. One young interpreter spends an entire afternoon crouched inside a tent translating notebooks recovered from dead Japanese officers after a failed counterattack in the hills nearby. Rain strikes the canvas roof heavily enough to drown out nearby conversation while the air smells of damp paper, sweat, and iodine drifting from a medical station farther down the muddy path. The notebooks contain inventory lists at first. Ammunition counts. Rice shortages. Fuel requests. Then gradually the entries become more fragmented. Shorter. Hungrier. Certain pages contain only names. Outside the tent, stretcher bearers move carefully through the mud carrying wounded Marines toward field hospitals hidden beneath camouflage netting. Helicopters do not yet dominate wars in this period. Movement still depends largely upon trucks, ships, boots, and exhaustion. Men disappear into jungle valleys for days at a time before returning hollow-eyed and silent beside patrols carrying captured maps, radios, and prisoners needing immediate interrogation. The interpreters occupy a strange position within all of this movement. Essential, yet not fully trusted. Some officers rely heavily upon them within hours. Others continue watching them cautiously despite the uniforms, despite the service, despite the work already performed. Certain interpreters notice conversations lowering in volume when they enter briefing tents. Others hear slurs muttered casually by exhausted soldiers who no longer bother concealing resentment beneath wartime fatigue. Yet the work continues regardless. Captured documents arrive constantly now. Orders recovered from caves. Letters taken from abandoned packs. Codes scribbled hastily onto scraps of waterproof paper. Every fragment might contain troop locations, supply conditions, or defensive plans capable of saving lives if translated quickly enough. Intelligence officers hover impatiently beside translation tables waiting for meaning to emerge from soaked pages laid carefully beneath lamps while rainwater drips from tent seams overhead. Night falls early beneath tropical cloud cover. Darkness settles heavily over the camps while distant artillery flickers occasionally beyond the jungle ridges like heat lightning trapped inside the earth itself. Generators continue humming. Radios crackle through static. Somewhere nearby, an exhausted interpreter leans over another stack of captured papers while insects strike repeatedly against the lamp above his head. And still more documents keep arriving from the rain. By the middle of the campaign season, the camps behind the front lines begin feeling less temporary than exhausted. Mud paths deepen into trenches beneath constant rain and boot traffic. Canvas rots slowly along the seams. Empty ration tins collect beside supply tents waiting for disposal that rarely comes quickly enough. The interpreters stop noticing certain discomforts entirely. Damp clothing. Mosquitoes gathering around lanterns. The permanent smell of mildew settling into blankets, notebooks, and skin. Fatigue simplifies the body's expectations. The work expands faster than the units processing it. Every offensive produces new material. Captured maps rolled inside waterproof tubes. Operational orders recovered from shattered command posts. Diaries taken from bodies lying for days beneath jungle foliage before patrols reach them. Sometimes the documents arrive neatly organized inside officer satchels. More often they come bundled carelessly in mud-stained cloth sacks beside weapons and broken field equipment. The interpreters spread the pages across rough wooden tables while ceiling fans push warm air uselessly around the tents. You watch them develop habits shaped entirely by pressure. One man translates fastest late at night after the generators quiet slightly and the camp settles into exhausted silence. Another mutters difficult phrases aloud repeatedly before committing them to paper. A third keeps small stones beside his desk, arranging and rearranging them unconsciously while studying damaged field reports whose ink has blurred almost beyond recovery. The work resembles restoration as much as translation. Meaning must be rescued from weather. Certain documents carry unsettling intimacy. A diary from a starving conscript describes dreams of rice and winter rivers back home. Another notebook contains detailed artillery coordinates beside careful sketches of cherry blossoms copied from memory during quiet hours between bombardments. One interpreter pauses for a long moment after discovering a grocery list tucked between military dispatches, written in handwriting almost identical to his mother's. Soy sauce. Pickled vegetables. Soap. Ordinary domestic life surviving absurdly close to annihilation. The interpreters rarely discuss these moments openly. The camps do not encourage prolonged emotional reflection. There are always more documents waiting. More prisoners arriving. More operations moving forward through valleys and ridgelines where humidity hangs motionless beneath the trees. Yet privately many begin feeling the strange emotional compression produced by proximity to familiar language emerging from enemy hands. The war becomes difficult to maintain at safe psychological distance when even casual handwriting evokes childhood memory. Interrogations intensify as American forces push deeper across the islands. Some occur inside proper intelligence tents equipped with tables, translators, and military police standing guard nearby. Others happen hastily beside roads, inside damaged bunkers, or beneath tarps stretched against rain during active operations. Conditions vary constantly. The pressure does not. Captured soldiers arrive exhausted, wounded, frightened, dehydrated, or fiercely silent. The interpreters sit between worlds neither side fully trusts. One afternoon rain falls so heavily that water runs beneath the tent walls while an interpreter questions a wounded Japanese radio operator captured near a ridge still burning from artillery strikes. The prisoner keeps glancing toward the storm outside rather than toward the Americans surrounding him. His uniform hangs in torn strips darkened by mud and blood. Each answer emerges slowly through exhaustion. Unit locations. Supply conditions. Retreat routes. The interpreter repeats the information calmly in English while officers scribble notes beneath flickering lantern light. Then suddenly the prisoner asks where the interpreter learned Japanese. The question hangs briefly inside the tent above the sound of rain. For several seconds, nobody moves very much at all. The interpreter eventually answers quietly that his parents came from California farming communities where Japanese remained spoken at home. The prisoner stares at him with visible confusion, as though the war itself has momentarily become incomprehensible. An American soldier speaking Japanese with the rhythms of ordinary family life unsettles assumptions carefully built through propaganda and isolation. The prisoner says nothing more afterward. Neither does the interpreter once the questioning ends. Outside, the rain continues hammering the jungle. These moments accumulate gradually inside the interpreters even when they try ignoring them. A familiar accent overheard from a cave entrance before surrender negotiations begin. A song hummed softly by wounded prisoners awaiting transport. The respectful phrasing older Japanese officers sometimes use automatically when addressing younger men they assume share cultural upbringing. Language bypasses distance too easily. It carries fragments of recognition through environments constructed entirely around dehumanization. Yet the interpreters cannot afford emotional hesitation for long. Military operations move quickly now. Entire nights disappear into translation work supporting planned assaults against increasingly desperate defensive positions. Surrender leaflets must be rewritten for local conditions. Captured maps cross-referenced against aerial reconnaissance. Prisoners questioned before units relocate again. Sleep becomes irregular and shallow. Some interpreters work 18 or 20 hours during major offensives before collapsing briefly onto cots still wearing mud-stained uniforms. The jungle itself begins affecting perception after enough weeks pass. Rainfall replaces clocks as the measure of time. Morning storms. Afternoon heat. Evening mist rising through shattered trees beside abandoned fortifications. Certain camps smell permanently of wet earth and diesel fuel. Others carry the sweet rot of tropical vegetation growing rapidly over battlefields almost before the dead are removed. Nature absorbs war here with frightening efficiency. Grass returns through shell craters. Vines swallow rusting equipment. Insects gather over abandoned trenches until entire positions disappear beneath green silence. At night, the interpreters sometimes sit outside the tents after finishing their shifts, smoking beside lantern light while distant artillery flashes beyond the mountains. Exhaustion strips conversation down to fragments. Weather observations. Supply rumors. Speculation about future deployments. Nobody speaks much about fear directly. The Pacific discourages theatrical emotion. The climate itself consumes too much energy already. Farther uphill, another convoy arrives carrying fresh stacks of captured documents wrapped beneath waterproof canvas. And before dawn fully returns, the lamps inside the intelligence tents begin glowing once more. Voices beneath the hills. The caves begin appearing long before the interpreters actually enter them. Dark openings cut into volcanic hillsides. Camouflage netting hanging in strips from shattered trees nearby. Smoke drifting faintly through dense vegetation after bombardments roll across the ridges. Entire sections of the island seem hollowed from within, transformed into underground worlds where soldiers survive for weeks or months beneath stone, heat, and darkness. From a distance, the entrances resemble natural shadows beneath the jungle canopy. Up close they smell of damp earth, burned powder, illness, and fear. By now the war has changed character again. The early campaigns carried movement. Landings. Rapid offensives. Expanding airfields. But the closer American forces move toward Japan itself, the more the fighting hardens into endurance. Defensive systems deepen underground. Civilians become trapped beside military positions. Surrender grows psychologically more difficult. Entire units disappear into tunnel networks where artillery and naval bombardment cannot fully reach them. The interpreters follow the armies into these altered conditions because language has become inseparable from survival. You watch the routines surrounding the caves repeat themselves day after day beneath unbearable humidity. Loudspeakers carried uphill through mud by exhausted Marines. Leaflets scattered across ravines after airstrikes. Interpreters crouched beside officers drafting surrender appeals while mortar fire sounds intermittently from hidden positions farther inside the hills. The same phrases return constantly, refined through repetition. Lay down your weapons. Medical treatment will be provided. Civilians may emerge safely. Resistance is hopeless. Yet every cave system changes the emotional terrain slightly. Some remain silent for days despite bombardment. Others answer surrender calls with rifle fire almost immediately. Occasionally voices emerge from the darkness asking cautious questions about food, wounded relatives, or treatment of prisoners. Those moments carry strange intimacy. The interpreters speak into darkness toward people they cannot see, using respectful language taught at family dinner tables years earlier in California or Washington farming towns. Their words travel through smoke, dust, and fear into hidden chambers where starving soldiers and civilians wait uncertainly beneath the earth. One interpreter spends 3 consecutive nights near a limestone ridge where civilians remain trapped inside a cave complex alongside retreating Japanese troops. Rain falls heavily every evening, turning the slopes into rivers of mud while American patrols hold positions among shattered trees outside the entrances. During daylight hours, artillery strikes nearby defensive positions farther uphill. At night, the interpreters speak through loudspeakers while insects gather around the lamps and rainwater drips steadily from the jungle canopy overhead. The work becomes emotionally exhausting because progress occurs slowly, if at all. A child cries somewhere deep inside the cave one evening after the loudspeaker broadcasts pause. Another night, an elderly civilian calls out asking whether the Americans truly have doctors. Sometimes surrender groups emerge cautiously carrying white cloths tied to sticks. Other times silence returns completely for hours while officers debate renewed bombardment. The interpreters remain suspended between military necessity and human desperation. Inside the camps below the ridges, the atmosphere grows heavier with each passing month of the war. Casualty reports arrive constantly now. Medical tents overflow during major operations. Rain rots supplies before replacement shipments arrive. Men develop jungle sores that refuse healing beneath the climate. Exhaustion settles visibly into posture and speech. Even the interpreters, once considered somewhat removed from direct combat, now move regularly through frontline conditions where sniper fire, artillery fragments, and sudden ambushes remain constant risks. One afternoon, an interpreter accompanies a patrol clearing bunker positions above a valley still covered in smoke from naval bombardment earlier that morning. The ground trembles occasionally beneath distant artillery while heat rises from black volcanic rock slick with recent rain. The patrol discovers a wounded Japanese officer inside a partially collapsed bunker beside stacks of field documents already soaked through by groundwater leaking from the walls. The officer attempts formal resistance at first, reciting rank and unit information with rigid precision despite obvious injury. Then the interpreter addresses him in careful Japanese. The atmosphere inside the bunker changes almost immediately. Not peacefully, not sentimentally, but recognizably. The officer pauses for several seconds before answering again, this time less formally, as though hearing familiar language inside the ruins has disturbed the emotional machinery keeping him composed. Outside, Marines continue securing the hillside while smoke drifts across the entrance. Inside the bunker, the interpreter translates questions calmly regarding nearby defensive positions, supply conditions, and troop strength. The officer eventually answers some, refuses others. Neither man fully meets the other's eyes. Afterward, while intelligence officers study the recovered documents outside beneath camouflage tarps, the interpreter sits briefly alone beside the bunker entrance, smoking with trembling hands he carefully hides inside the folds of his uniform. No one comments on it. Everyone nearby carries exhaustion differently now. Some through anger, others through silence, the interpreters through accumulation. The caves continue changing them because the caves compress war into human proximity impossible to ignore. Translation no longer happens safely inside rear tents beside stacks of paper. Now it occurs face to face with wounded soldiers, terrified civilians, and starving survivors emerging slowly from darkness beneath the hills. Language acquires physical weight in these moments. Tone influences surrender. Hesitation alters trust. A single phrase may determine whether frightened civilians step into daylight or remain underground while bombardment resumes. At night, the interpreters sometimes dream about voices without faces. Questions echoing from tunnel entrances. Children crying somewhere beyond visible light. The soft static hum of loudspeakers before broadcasts begin again. Sleep becomes fragmented beneath operational pressure and tropical heat. Men wake uncertain whether certain conversations actually occurred or merely replayed themselves through exhaustion inside memory. Still, the work expands. More islands. More caves. More hidden civilians and isolated soldiers refusing surrender long after strategic defeat becomes inevitable. The Pacific itself seems to harden psychologically as the war advances westward. Resistance deepens. Fear deepens with it. And always the interpreters remain beside the entrances, speaking carefully into the dark. By late summer, the hills themselves seem exhausted. Entire ridgelines have been broken apart by shellfire until the earth resembles something dug open repeatedly and never allowed to heal. Trees stand stripped bare above black volcanic slopes where rainwater carries ashen loose soil downward into valleys crowded with tents, supply dumps, and aid stations. The interpreters move constantly now between intelligence sections, medical units, and frontline positions where surrender attempts continue unfolding cave by cave beneath oppressive heat. The war no longer advances cleanly across maps. It seeps slowly through stone. The loudspeaker teams become familiar figures along the forward areas. Generators strapped onto trailers. Coils of cable dragged through mud. Amplifiers wrapped carefully beneath tarps during storms. Marines joke bitterly that the interpreters spend half the war speaking into mountains and the other half translating what comes back out. Yet the work matters too much to dismiss entirely. Certain caves surrender after hours of negotiation that might otherwise have required flamethrowers, demolitions, or prolonged bombardment. Civilians emerge carrying children wrapped in blankets darkened by soot and rainwater. Wounded soldiers stagger into daylight blinking against the brightness after weeks underground. You watch the interpreters develop a particular rhythm during these operations. Calm voice first. Formal address. Reassurance repeated patiently. Warnings delivered without threat whenever possible. The broadcasts continue through rainstorms, sniper fire, generator failures, and exhaustion because consistency itself becomes persuasive. Fear listens differently than reason. Terrified people inside caves measure tone before they trust meaning. One evening near a shattered ridge overlooking the sea, An interpreter spends hours speaking toward a tunnel network where several civilians remain trapped alongside isolated Japanese troops. The sun disappears early beneath storm cloud, leaving the entire hillside washed in weak gray light while waves break far below against volcanic cliffs. Smoke from earlier bombardments still drifts through the ravines. Somewhere behind the interpreter, Marines crouch beside machine gun positions waiting silently for movement. The interpreter continues speaking anyway. He describes medical treatment, food, water, protection for civilians. His voice carries through the loudspeaker across broken rock and tangled roots still burning faintly from artillery strikes earlier that afternoon. At first nothing answers except wind moving through damaged trees. Then eventually a woman's voice emerges from somewhere inside the darkness asking whether children will truly be allowed to leave safely. The question changes the atmosphere immediately. For several seconds, even the Marines nearby remain motionless, listening. The interpreter answers carefully that children may come out first if necessary. The woman says nothing more afterward. Night settles gradually over the ridge while rain begins falling again in soft, uneven drops against helmets, leaves, and equipment cases. Hours later, just before midnight, the first civilians emerge carrying cloth bundles and improvised white flags cut from shirts and bedding. They walk slowly down the muddy slope blinking beneath flashlight beams while corpsmen move forward cautiously to guide them toward waiting medical tents farther downhill. Moments like these travel through the interpreter units quickly afterward, repeated quietly beside mess tables or inside tents late at night while men smoke through exhaustion. Not triumph exactly. More a temporary interruption of catastrophe. The Pacific rarely offers clean emotional resolution. Too much suffering surrounds even successful outcomes. Yet the interpreters cling to such moments because they provide fragile evidence that language can occasionally reduce destruction rather than merely document it afterward. Still, the moral strain deepens. Not every negotiation succeeds. Some cave systems remain silent until assaults begin again. Others produce civilians only after military commanders authorize renewed bombardment. The interpreters often hear fear directly before violence resumes. Pleading voices. Confused questions. Elderly civilians asking whether surrender means execution. Young soldiers repeating propaganda they barely seem to believe anymore. The emotional residue of these conversations lingers long after operations conclude. One interpreter begins smoking constantly between assignments despite previously disliking cigarettes entirely. Another develops insomnia severe enough that corpsmen quietly recommend sedatives whenever rest becomes possible. A third stops volunteering for loudspeaker duty after witnessing civilians killed during crossfire while attempting to surrender from a hillside position. None of these reactions are considered unusual by now. The Pacific has begun wearing down everyone differently. The environment itself contributes to the exhaustion. Heat trapped beneath jungle canopy. Rainfall arriving with almost theatrical violence before vanishing again into suffocating humidity. Rot spreading through clothing, boots, and paper alike. Certain camps smell permanently of mold, sweat, antiseptic, and burned fuel. Others carry the faint sweetness of decomposing vegetation mixed with smoke drifting continuously from nearby combat zones. The interpreters absorb these atmospheres day after day until memory itself begins smelling like the islands. And still the war continues moving westward. The closer American forces advance toward Japan, the heavier the psychological resistance becomes. Captured soldiers increasingly speak of death before surrender as though discussing weather. Civilians hide inside caves for weeks even when starving. Entire villages empty themselves into tunnel systems beneath bombardment. The interpreters understand part of the fear because they understand the language shaping it. Honor. shame, obligation, sacrifice. The concepts repeat endlessly through interrogations, leaflets, diaries, and loudspeaker appeals until the words themselves begin losing stable meaning through overuse. At night, the interpreters sometimes gather quietly outside intelligence tents after their shifts end. Rainwater drips steadily from camouflage netting overhead while distant naval guns flash faintly along the horizon beyond the hills. Nobody speaks very loudly anymore. Fatigue has narrowed conversation into fragments once again. Supply rumors, weather, speculation about future invasions still being planned farther north. Someone eventually mentions Japan itself. Not strategically, personally. Parents still living there. Cousins never met. Villages remembered only through stories told before the war. The conversation fades quickly afterward because no one knows what future awaits beyond the next operation. Yet the silence that follows feels heavier than ordinary exhaustion. Far uphill, another loudspeaker team prepares to move before dawn toward newly secured tunnel systems hidden inside the mountains. And somewhere within those dark passages, frightened voices still wait beneath the earth listening for what the interpreters will say next. The voices that remained. By the final year of the war, exhaustion settles over the Pacific like weather that no longer passes. The maps inside command tents continue changing. Arrows move steadily closer toward the Japanese home islands. Airfields expand. Naval routes thicken with supply convoys. Yet among the interpreters the emotional atmosphere becomes slower, heavier, and more inward. The early urgency of deployment has faded into accumulated fatigue. Too many interrogations. Too many caves. Too many notebooks recovered from dead men whose handwriting still resembles ordinary life. The camps behind the lines grow larger and more permanent with each new operation. Roads once carved quickly through jungle mud are now reinforced with planks, crushed coral, and steel matting. Warehouses rise beside landing strips crowded with transport aircraft. Entire administrative systems spread across the islands, medical stations, signal corps offices, intelligence compounds, prisoner processing centers. The war has become industrial in scale. Yet the interpreters still spend most of their days inside rooms no larger than classrooms, leaning over paper beneath weak electric light. Yet within those fragments lives a strange quietness. A soldier describing moonlight over flooded grass. Another worrying about whether his younger brother has been conscripted yet. A third apologizing repeatedly to his parents for not writing sooner despite knowing the letters will probably never be sent. The interpreter reads the pages slowly beneath a lantern while rain taps against the roof overhead. Outside the tent, mechanics repair damaged vehicles beneath tarps illuminated by weak work lights. Farther downhill, wounded men arrive continuously from operations still unfolding near the ridges. The war remains violent everywhere around him. Yet inside the diary another atmosphere survives briefly. Homesickness. Shame. Memory. Human beings trying to remain recognizable to themselves while history crushes structure around them. The interpreters rarely discuss how much these documents affect them because the work still demands efficiency above introspection. Intelligence officers require summaries, coordinates, troop estimates, defensive plans. Emotional texture has little operational value. So most interpreters learn to compartmentalize instinctively. One part of the mind translates military necessity. Another quietly absorbs grief. At times the emotional boundaries blur unexpectedly. A young interpreter from Washington State hears an elderly prisoner speaking in a rural dialect nearly identical to the accent his grandparents used during childhood visits. Meanwhile, the Pacific continues deteriorating physically. The climate consumes everything eventually. Metal rusts within weeks. Uniforms bleach beneath tropical sun before rotting apart in rain. Paper curls, softens, and disintegrates. Men lose weight steadily during prolonged campaigns. Skin infections spread through camps despite constant medical efforts. Entire units begin carrying the dull posture of overextended machinery barely maintaining motion. Even victory feels exhausted now. One evening, a tropical storm cuts power across several sections of an intelligence compound while interpreters are processing newly captured documents from defensive positions farther north. Lanterns replace electric light. They have spent too long translating fear, surrender, injury, and death to return easily to innocence. The Pacific has entered them gradually through repetition more than trauma alone. Outside, thunder rolls continuously across the island while supply trucks struggle through flooded roads toward the beaches. And still more documents continue arriving through the storm. The closer the war moves toward its conclusion, the stranger time begins feeling inside the Pacific camps. Days no longer separate themselves clearly. Rainstorms blur into artillery reports. Sleepless nights dissolve into brief humid mornings where the same trucks carry the same crates past the same rows of tents before disappearing again beneath jungle roads slick with mud. Entire weeks vanish beneath paperwork, interrogations, and operational briefings without anyone fully noticing where the hours went. The interpreters continue working because stopping would force reflection, and reflection has become increasingly difficult to contain. Rumors spread constantly now about the coming invasion of Japan. Maps pinned inside intelligence offices grow more detailed each month. Coastal defenses, civilian population centers, railway networks, tunnel systems. Translators receive additional briefings regarding civilian communication, evacuation procedures, and psychological warfare planning. The distinction between soldier and civilian has become increasingly unstable as the war advances. Entire villages now exist inside the operational language of military planning. One interpreter spends several weeks attached to a prisoner processing center established near a recently secured harbor. The facility occupies a cluster of weathered buildings reinforced with sandbags and barbed wire overlooking dark volcanic beaches where landing craft continue arriving through rough surf. Rainwater gathers beneath the floorboards during storms, leaving the room smelling permanently of mildew, salt, and disinfectant. Prisoners pass through constantly now. Some wounded, some starving. Some too exhausted even to maintain hostility. The interpreter begins noticing how surrender alters people physically. Certain prisoners continue sitting rigidly upright long after capture, preserving fragments of military formality despite obvious collapse. Others seem to age visibly within days once fear and adrenaline recede. Many ask first about food, water, medical treatment, family, not strategy or politics. Human needs reassert themselves quickly after prolonged survival pressure loosens. One elderly reservist captured during fighting farther inland speaks almost continuously during interrogation, not because he wishes to provide intelligence, but because silence frightens him after weeks underground inside cave systems cut off from reliable communication. He describes rainfall patterns back home near Osaka, fishing boats, school festivals before the war, rice shortages during his childhood. The interpreter translates patiently while intelligence officers wait for military relevance that rarely arrives. Eventually, the prisoner apologizes for wasting everyone's time. The interpreter hesitates before translating that sentence fully. Moments like this accumulate quietly inside him afterward. The war has trained everyone to categorize efficiently. prisoner, civilian, officer, enemy, asset. Yet prolonged exposure to language disrupts categories constantly because speech carries personality faster than institutions can suppress it. Fear sounds human in every dialect. So does loneliness. Outside the processing center, the Pacific continues moving with indifferent rhythm. Waves striking volcanic rock beneath cloudy skies. Rain sweeping across the harbor before clearing briefly into violent tropical sunlight. Cargo nets swinging above crowded docks where fuel drums, ammunition crates, and medical supplies disappear inland toward operations still underway. The machinery of war never fully pauses even when individual men collapse from exhaustion within it. At night, the interpreters sometimes receive temporary moments of stillness rare enough to feel unreal. One evening, several sit outside the processing buildings after midnight while the rain finally pauses for the first time in days. The sea beyond the harbor glows faintly beneath broken cloud cover. Ships drift at anchor with navigation lights reflected across black water moving almost invisibly in the dark. Nobody speaks for a long while. The silence feels fragile rather than peaceful. Eventually, one interpreter mentions that he no longer remembers the exact sound of the train station near his childhood neighborhood in California. Another says he can still remember the smell of orange groves after rain. The conversation fades again almost immediately afterward. Memory has become dangerous terrain now because the Pacific compresses emotional life towards survival and routine. Too much reflection threatens operational focus. Yet the memories continue surfacing unexpectedly anyway. During interrogations. During storms. While translating letters recovered from dead soldiers. The interpreters exist between languages, between loyalties imposed from outside, between versions of themselves that no longer align comfortably. Then suddenly the war changes. At first only fragments of information spread through the camps. A new weapon. Extraordinary destruction. Entire cities damaged beyond comprehension. Rumors travel unevenly across the Pacific through radio traffic, briefing summaries, and exhausted speculation repeated beside mess tables after midnight. Few fully understand what has happened yet. The scale resists immediate comprehension. But the interpreters begin noticing another shift almost at once. The tone inside captured communications changes. Confusion replaces certainty. Orders become fragmented. Some officers still demand resistance while others discuss impossible shortages and collapsed command structures. Civilians appear increasingly within operational messages. Entire sections of military communication begin sounding stunned, as though language itself has not yet adapted to the reality unfolding around it. Inside the camps, officers move faster now. Maps replaced. Briefings revised. Discussions of invasion balanced suddenly against discussions of surrender procedures and occupation planning. The emotional atmosphere becomes unstable. Relief struggles against disbelief. Nobody fully trusts the possibility of ending yet because the Pacific has trained everyone into expecting continuation. The interpreters continue working through the uncertainty beneath lamps burning late into the night. Outside, warm rain begins falling again across the harbor while ships rock gently against their moorings in the dark. And somewhere far across the ocean, voices are already beginning to speak the language of surrender. The language of surrender. The first surrender broadcasts arrive through static. Voices emerge unevenly from radios crowded inside signal tents where exhausted operators lean close to receivers glowing faintly beneath dim electric light. Certain broadcasts appear formal almost to the point of unreality, as though the speakers themselves cannot fully believe the words they are transmitting. Surrender occupies language awkwardly after years devoted entirely to sacrifice and endurance. Entire institutions must suddenly speak in a vocabulary they spent years condemning. You watch the interpreters work with almost painful concentration now. Every sentence matters enormously. Ambiguity could prolong fighting accidentally. Mistranslation could alter military decisions affecting thousands of lives. Men who once translated diaries and prisoner interrogations now sit at the center of history unfolding through exhausted radio transmissions carried across oceans by static and weather. The interpreters spend entire nights drafting documents intended not for isolated cave systems anymore, but for an entire collapsing empire struggling to reorganize itself around defeat. One afternoon, an interpreter accompanies a delegation meeting Japanese naval officers aboard a damaged vessel anchored offshore beneath low-gray cloud. The sea moves gently against the hull while rainwater drips from cables overhead. The Japanese officers stand rigidly formal despite visible exhaustion. Uniforms carefully maintained. Shoes polished despite shortages and bombardment. Ritual dignity surviving collapse. The interpreter moves between both sides quietly, translating discussions regarding disarmament schedules and harbor security. Yet beneath the procedural language, another emotional current remains constantly present. Shame, relief, suspicion, grief. The war has lasted too long for surrender to feel simple. Every sentence seems balanced precariously between exhaustion and disbelief. Even silence carries political weight now. At one point, the senior Japanese officer pauses before asking the interpreter where he learned such precise formal Japanese. The question arrives softly enough that several Americans nearby almost miss it entirely. The interpreter answers calmly that his parents spoke Japanese at home in California before the war. The interpreters have become living contradictions moving through the ruins of imperial collapse. Meanwhile, the Pacific itself grows strangely quiet. Not entirely. Engines still move through the harbors. Aircraft continue overhead. Supply operations remain enormous. But the emotional pressure of imminent death has loosened slightly across many camps. Men sleep longer when possible. Some shave carefully again after months of neglect. Others write letters home describing weather, food, and silence because silence itself has become noteworthy. At night, ships anchored offshore glow softly beneath blackout-reduced lighting while interpreters continue working inside administration buildings crowded with surrender paperwork. And somewhere beyond the ocean horizon, Japan itself waits in stunned silence for the Americans now preparing to arrive. The occupation begins first through paperwork. Before large numbers of troops move ashore, before civilians fully emerge into streets shaped by air raids and shortages, entire systems of language must already exist waiting beneath the surface. Instructions for transport authorities. Food distribution notices. Curfew regulations. Medical directives. Harbor protocols. Interpreters sit for endless hours inside crowded offices translating the administrative architecture of surrender while ceiling fans push warm air through rooms smelling of damp uniforms, stale coffee, and carbon paper. Outside the windows, the Pacific shifts gradually toward autumn. Typhoon clouds gather far offshore while harbor water darkens beneath longer evenings and lower sun. The ships anchored across the bays no longer resemble invasion fleets entirely. They look tired now. Rust streaks spreading along hulls weathered by years of salt and war. Deck crews moving with slower rhythm. Searchlights sweeping less frequently across the water after nightfall. Even the machinery of conflict appears exhausted. You watch the interpreters adapt uneasily to the altered atmosphere. For years, every translation carried immediate tactical urgency. Coordinates. Interrogations. Surrender negotiations beside cave entrances. Now the work stretches into bureaucracy and reconstruction. The emotional tempo slows, but the psychological strain does not disappear with it. In some ways, the quieter environment allows accumulated fatigue to surface more clearly than before. One interpreter arrives in Yokohama aboard a transport vessel during grey morning rain that blurs the harbor cranes and warehouse roofs into pale silhouettes against the shoreline. Civilians stand watching silently from the docks while occupation personnel move cargo down wet gangways slick with seawater and oil. The city smells faintly of smoke even now. Not fresh fire, but old burning soaked permanently into timber, brick dust, and ruined earth. The interpreter pauses briefly before stepping onto the dock. For several seconds, he simply watches the harbor workers moving through the rain. Some wear patched civilian clothing. Others still carry fragments of military uniforms stripped of insignia. Most avoid direct eye contact with the Americans disembarking around them. Hunger and uncertainty have changed posture everywhere. Shoulders lowered slightly inward. Movements careful and economical. The interpreters move constantly through these environments now. Government offices. Schools converted into occupation headquarters. Police stations. Hospitals. Refugee centers. Warehouses distributing food supplies. They translate regulations, disputes, medical concerns, ration systems, and endless administrative meetings attempting to stabilize a defeated country before winter deepens. The work becomes less theatrical than wartime intelligence, but no less emotionally demanding. One afternoon, an interpreter accompanies medical officers inspecting temporary shelters established inside a damaged school building near Tokyo. Rainwater leaks steadily through sections of the roof into buckets placed along the corridors. Families sleep behind blankets hung from classroom walls for privacy. Children study arithmetic beside broken windows patched with cardboard and paper. The smell inside the building combines disinfectant, damp clothing, cooked rice, and smoke from improvised heating stoves. An elderly woman asks the interpreter quietly whether the Americans intend to remain forever. The question lingers afterward because no one in the room can truly answer it. Outside the schoolyard, autumn wind carries leaves across cracked pavement while occupation trucks move steadily through streets still crowded with rubble. The war has ended militarily, but emotionally the country remains suspended between collapse and continuation. The interpreters stand directly inside that unstable space, translating not merely language anymore, but coexistence. At times the emotional contradictions become almost unbearable in their subtlety. A Japanese civilian thanks an interpreter for helping secure medicine for a sick child, then pauses awkwardly after noticing the American uniform. A former naval officer bows respectfully before requesting additional food rations for displaced families living near the harbor. Children practice hesitant English phrases learned from occupation soldiers while elderly civilians watch from doorways carrying expressions too exhausted for resentment. The interpreters themselves no longer fully belong anywhere emotionally simple. In America, many still have families recovering from internment camps only recently beginning to close. In Japan, they encounter people who speak with familiar rhythms inherited from grandparents and childhood kitchens. Yet the devastation surrounding them also carries undeniable historical responsibility. Entire cities flattened. Infrastructure shattered. Hunger spreading through neighborhoods once dense with ordinary civilian life. The emotional terrain resists clean loyalty or condemnation. You begin noticing how frequently the interpreters seek moments of solitude now. Smoking beside rivers after long administrative shifts. Standing quietly on harbor piers watching fog move across anchored ships at dawn. walking through damaged neighborhoods without speaking. The occupation requires constant mediation between worlds already exhausted by years of conflict. Silence becomes restorative in ways sleep often no longer is. At night, many of the occupation offices remain brightly lit while translators continue processing endless streams of directives and reports. Typewriters echo through corridors late into the evening. Rain taps against broken roof tiles. Somewhere in the distance, trains begin operating regularly again through districts still scarred by firebombing. The sound travels softly across the cities after dark like proof that movement itself has survived. One interpreter receives a letter from California informing him that his family has finally left the camp where they spent most of the war years. The letter contains ordinary details. His mother planting vegetables again. His younger sister searching for work. Neighbors returning slowly. A church reopening services. The normality of the details unsettles him more than dramatic news might have. After years spent translating surrender, fear, hunger, and collapse, ordinary life now feels strangely distant, almost theoretical. Outside his office window, cold rain falls steadily across the occupation city while bicycles move through puddled streets below. And for the first time since the train departed west years earlier, the war begins loosening its grip slowly enough to be felt. Returning through quiet streets. Winter arrives slowly across the occupation zones. Cold rain replaces the heavy tropical storms of the southern islands, and the cities settle beneath long grey skies carrying smoke from coal fires burning in barrels, damaged furnaces, and temporary stoves assembled from salvaged metal. Outside, snow begins falling lightly across the rail yard, settling briefly against twisted steel before melting into black water along the tracks. The interpreters increasingly find themselves trapped inside such moments. Simple conversations suddenly revealing distances too large for politics alone to explain. Entire populations lived through completely different versions of the same war. American abundance beside Japanese collapse. Internment camps beside occupation authority. Service medals beside confiscated family property. The contradictions never resolve neatly because history rarely organizes itself according to emotional fairness. At night, many of the occupation buildings grow quieter now. Offices close earlier. Fewer emergency briefings interrupt sleep. Interpreters sometimes walk alone through districts where reconstruction continues beneath dim street lamps and drifting snow. Vendors sell roasted sweet potatoes beside damaged storefronts repaired just enough to reopen. Small restaurants operate again behind curtains glowing warmly against the cold. Somewhere farther away, temple bells travel softly across winter air, already carrying traces of another ordinary year beginning. You watch the interpreters noticing details they once ignored entirely during wartime urgency. Laundry hanging behind apartment windows. Couples crossing bridges together after work. School children practicing songs inside reopened classrooms. Tiny fragments of continuity returning almost invisibly through repetition. Civilian life rebuilding itself one routine at a time. Yet emotionally, many of the interpreters remain suspended. The war has shaped them too thoroughly for immediate reintegration into peace. Certain habits continue automatically. Studying exits upon entering rooms. Sleeping lightly. Translating overheard Japanese phrases unconsciously while walking crowded streets. Measuring silence for hidden tension even where none exists anymore. The body remembers institutions long after official duties end. One evening, an interpreter receives permission to visit a rural district outside the city where distant relatives of his grandparents once lived before immigration carried parts of the family toward America decades earlier. Snow covers the roads and fields surrounding the village, while smoke rises from low rooftops gathered beneath dark hillsides. The houses are smaller than he imagined from childhood stories. The river narrower. The winter air sharper. An elderly woman welcomes him cautiously after learning his family name. Inside the house, coal heat drifts through rooms lit softly by paper lanterns and weak electric bulbs. Tea steams gently beside frost-covered windows while the woman studies the American uniform with visible uncertainty. Eventually she asks whether his parents are healthy. Then whether California truly contains orange groves large enough to stretch beyond sight. The interpreter answers quietly while snow continues falling outside the house. For several hours the war recedes almost completely. Conversation moves through family stories, weather, harvests, aging relatives, and missing cousins whose locations remain uncertain after years of conflict and displacement. Yet even this fragile peace carries emotional instability beneath it. The interpreter belongs to the room through ancestry and language. He also remains unmistakably foreign within it. When he leaves later that night, the elderly woman bows deeply at the doorway while snow gathers along the shoulders of his military coat. The train carrying him back toward the occupation city moves slowly through darkness beneath frozen telephone wires and empty winter fields. And somewhere between the village and the station, he realizes the war has permanently divided memory itself into separate countries that may never fully reconnect again. The ships carrying occupation personnel back across the Pacific depart quietly. No crowds gather along the docks with banners or military bands. Some shave carefully each morning as though preparing themselves gradually for civilian visibility again. Others sleep for extraordinary lengths of time once operational pressure finally loosens enough for exhaustion to surface fully. You watch the interpreters struggle quietly with a transition already underway. The routines that sustained them through years of military structure begin dissolving aboard ship. No urgent interrogations. No late-night intelligence briefings. No surrender negotiations beside radios crackling through static. The absence creates strange emotional space many no longer know how to occupy comfortably. Some begin writing long letters home they repeatedly revise before mailing. Others drift through card games, smoking areas, and mess halls carrying a detached silence that resembles shock more than rest. One interpreter spends hours each evening standing near the stern watching the wake spread outward behind the ship beneath fading daylight. The Pacific appears calmer now than during the wartime crossings years earlier, though perhaps only because the danger has receded psychologically. Flying fish occasionally break the surface beside the hull. Storm fronts move across the horizon without threatening convoy alerts or blackout procedures. Yet the ocean still carries memory. Certain engine vibrations resemble troop transports from earlier campaigns closely enough to tighten the chest unexpectedly before reason intervenes. At night, the ships darken gradually while sailors secure equipment against weather moving in from the north. The interpreters sit inside crowded lounges where cigarette smoke drifts beneath dim ceiling lamps and conversations rise and fall uncertainly around them. Men speak about jobs waiting back home. Universities accepting veterans. Families reopening businesses lost during the war years. But beneath those conversations lingers another quieter fear rarely expressed directly. Whether home still exists in recognizable form. He reads descriptions of ordinary routines now long vanished, gardening attempts beside tar paper walls, church services inside converted recreation halls, younger children organizing baseball games beyond the watchtowers during evenings filled with blowing dust. The emotional distance between those letters and the occupation cities he has just left feels almost impossible to reconcile. Outside, the ship rolls heavily through dark water while engines pulse steadily beneath the floor. Days later, the American coastline finally emerges through fog before dawn. The sight produces less celebration than silence. Men gather along the rails wearing heavy coats against the cold, while harbor lights flicker faintly across gray morning water. Tugboats move slowly between anchored ships. Factory chimneys release smoke into winter air. Everything appears ordinary in ways that feel almost surreal after years spent inside jungle camps, bombed cities, and military compounds spread across the Pacific. The interpreters disembark carrying duffel bags that now contain entire emotional geographies compressed into objects. Japanese dictionaries swollen by humidity. Occupation passes. Photographs. Letters from home and from overseas. Military documents stamped by commands already beginning to dissolve into post-war bureaucracy. The war survives materially in small things first. You watch them move through train stations crowded with civilians who no longer resemble the populations frozen inside memory from before deployment. Fashion has shifted slightly. Speech patterns too. Advertisements fill walls once stripped bare during wartime rationing. Children run carelessly through terminals without understanding why certain veterans pause instinctively at sudden loud noises or search rooms automatically for exits before sitting down. Some interpreters receive warm welcomes from relatives waiting on the platforms. Mothers crying openly despite years of restraint. Fathers shaking hands too firmly because emotion still feels dangerous when expressed directly. Others arrive to quieter reunions shaped by displacement, financial loss, or emotional fatigue accumulated during internment and separation. The country has continued moving while they remain suspended inside war. One interpreter travels by train back toward California farmland his family lost during confinement. Winter fields pass outside the windows beneath pale sunlight, while telephone poles rise and fall beside the tracks in familiar rhythm almost identical to the journey that carried him east years earlier toward the language school. Yet the emotional landscape has changed completely. Then the future narrowed toward uncertainty. Now it widens again, though unevenly. At one small station, the train pauses beside rows of orange groves darkened by recent rain. The interpreter stares through the window longer than necessary. The smell of citrus drifts faintly into the carriage when the doors open briefly at the platform. Suddenly memory returns with painful clarity. Childhood afternoons before the war, his mother hanging laundry behind the house, baseball games played beneath dry California sunlight untouched by military urgency or political suspicion. The simplicity of the memory feels almost unbearable after everything that followed it. The train continues northward through quiet agricultural towns where ordinary American life carries on beneath winter sky. And slowly, without announcement or ceremony, the interpreters begin disappearing back into the country they once had to prove belonged to them. The quiet weight of translation. The years after the war settle unevenly across the interpreters. Some move quickly into civilian professions shaped partly by military language work. Teaching, government service, international business, diplomacy. One former interpreter rents a small apartment above a grocery store in Los Angeles while attending classes during the day under the GI Bill. Streetcars rattle past the building each morning beneath pale coastal sunlight while shop owners sweep sidewalks below before opening their doors. The city smells of engine exhaust, ocean air, coffee drifting from diners, and citrus unloaded from trucks arriving before dawn. Civilian life surrounds him everywhere now. Students discussing examinations. Couples arguing softly beside bus stops. Children carrying school books through neighborhoods rebuilding themselves after wartime absence. Yet emotionally, he often remains elsewhere. The emotional transition from war to peace proves difficult partly because peace contains too much unstructured quiet. During the Pacific campaigns, every hour possessed operational direction. Translate this document. Interrogate this prisoner. Broadcast this surrender appeal. Movement itself protected the mind from deeper reflection. Civilian life allows memory more room to circulate. Many interpreters discover that language itself has changed emotionally for them. Japanese no longer belongs solely to childhood kitchens, grandparents, or community festivals. It now carries battlefield associations layered permanently beside earlier memory. Certain phrases immediately recall caves filled with civilians. Business correspondence. Yet even here the emotional undercurrents remain present. Japanese sailors speak cautiously around American officials. Older immigrants discuss relatives still missing after the war. News from overseas arrives through newspapers describing reconstruction, shortages, political reforms, and war crime tribunals unfolding across cities the interpreter once walked through wearing occupation uniforms. Sometimes the interpreter stands alone beside the harbor after work watching evening fog absorb the outlines of ships anchored offshore. The Pacific lies beyond them all. Invisible now beyond distance and weather, yet emotionally still very near. Somewhere across that ocean remain the islands where voices once emerged from caves beneath artillery smoke. The harbors where surrender documents changed the structure of history. The classrooms where language first transformed from family inheritance into military necessity. The war exists geographically far away now, but memory does not obey geography very well. You begin noticing how frequently the interpreters avoid dramatic storytelling about their service even among other veterans. Infantrymen describe battles. Pilots discuss missions. Sailors remember storms and convoys. The interpreters often remain quieter because their war unfolded through ambiguity rather than straightforward heroism. Translation resists simplification. They carried conversations between enemies. They persuaded civilians to emerge from caves. They translated surrender while their own families remained confined behind American fences. The emotional architecture lacks clean triumph. One evening, several former interpreters gather inside a modest community hall after a Veterans Association meeting in San Jose. Folding chairs scrape softly across wooden floors while rain taps against the windows outside. Coffee cools untouched beside stacks of pamphlets discussing resettlement assistance and employment programs for returning Japanese American veterans. The men speak quietly at first about ordinary matters: jobs, marriages, aging parents, school applications. Eventually conversation drifts toward the Pacific. Not battles exactly. Atmospheres. The smell of damp paper inside intelligence tents. Tropical rain striking loudspeaker equipment during surrender broadcasts. The strange quiet inside occupation train stations after curfew. For a few hours, the room fills with details no one else nearby would fully understand. Not because the experiences were secret, but because they occupied emotional territory too complicated for most public narratives about the war. Outside, rainwater gathers beneath the street lamps while the city settles gradually toward midnight. Inside the hall, the interpreters continue speaking softly as though careful not to wake something still sleeping beneath memory. The decades pass quietly around them. Not silently. America after the war grows louder each year through highways, televisions, factories, protests, suburbs, airports, and expanding cities pushing steadily outward across farmland once interrupted only by rail lines and orchards. Yet the interpreters themselves often move through these decades with restrained visibility. They marry, raise children, open businesses, teach classes. You watch old habits survive beneath ordinary civilian routines even after 20 or 30 years pass. One former interpreter still folds official letters with precise military neatness before placing them inside envelopes. Another keeps dictionaries arranged carefully beside his desk long after retirement. A third continues waking before dawn automatically because wartime schedules permanently altered the body's relationship with sleep. Their children sometimes notice the habits without understanding their origins. History survives domestically through gestures before stories. Meanwhile, recognition arrives slowly. Military historians begin publishing studies emphasizing how crucial Japanese-American interpreters became during the Pacific campaigns. Intelligence officers openly acknowledge that translated documents, interrogations, and surrender negotiations saved lives and shortened operations. Ceremonies expand. Medals are reconsidered. Community organizations gather oral histories before aging veterans disappear entirely. Yet even recognition carries complicated emotional texture for many interpreters. Praise cannot fully untangle contradiction. The same country now honoring service once imprisoned their families behind wire fences beneath armed guard. Occupation trains crowded with civilians. Intelligence tents lit dimly against tropical darkness. Family portraits taken before internment changed everything. His granddaughter asks quietly whether he was frightened during the war. The question hangs in the room beside the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. For several moments he studies one photograph without answering immediately. Then he says that fear eventually became ordinary enough that people stopped naming it directly. The statement confuses the child slightly because children expect emotion to arrive dramatically. But the interpreters learn something different during the Pacific campaigns. Fear often accumulates through repetition rather than shock. Rain every night. Harbor fog drifting across post-war America. The landscapes overlap now beyond separation. As the years continue passing, many interpreters begin speaking more openly at schools, museums, and community events. Not because memory has become easier, but because silence risks erasure. Younger generations grow up inside an America increasingly distant from the emotional reality of the war years. The interpreters understand that history simplified too aggressively eventually loses moral texture. One former interpreter stands before a small audience inside a local library during the 1980s while autumn rain taps softly against the windows outside. He speaks calmly about translation work during the Pacific campaigns. Captured diaries. Surrender broadcasts. Occupation offices. His voice remains measured almost to the point of gentleness. Then someone asks what he remembers most clearly. He pauses for a long moment before answering. Not victory. Not defeat. Voices. The frightened voice of a civilian mother calling from inside a cave. The exhausted voice of prisoners asking for water after weeks underground. The formal voices of surrender negotiations carried through static-filled radios. The quiet voices of American-born interpreters translating a war against the language of their own childhood homes. History remained human for him because language prevented distance from fully hardening. The room falls silent afterward except for rain against the glass. Yet never entirely gone. After the voices. Rain falls softly across the harbor long after midnight. The docks are quieter now than they once were during the war years. No blackout orders. No crowded troop transports waiting beneath camouflage netting and weak signal lamps. Cargo cranes stand motionless against low cloud while seawater moves gently along the pilings below, carrying reflections of scattered lights drifting across the dark surface. Somewhere farther inland, a train horn sounds briefly before fading into the wet air beyond the city. The Pacific remains where it has always been. Wide. Indifferent. Patient. Ships still cross it carrying containers, passengers, machinery, and ordinary commercial life between countries once bound together through violence and surrender. Most travelers moving across the ocean now never think about the interpreters who once sat beneath leaking canvas roofs translating fear by lantern light while rain struck the jungle outside. History rarely preserves the emotional texture of quiet labor for very long. It remembers battles more easily than voices. Yet the voices endured. Inside caves where civilians waited beneath bombardment believing death inevitable. Inside interrogation tents heavy with tropical heat and exhaustion. Inside occupation offices where defeated cities attempted to speak themselves slowly back toward ordinary life. The interpreters moved through all those worlds carrying language between people trained to distrust one another completely. Not heroes in the simple shape nations prefer. Something more difficult. Witnesses positioned too close to every side. You can still imagine them sometimes. A young man standing beside a loudspeaker on a rain-soaked ridge while fog moves through shattered trees around him. Another leaning over captured notebooks deep into the night while generators hum outside the tent. Another translating harbor regulations inside a damaged occupation office where winter light falls across broken station platforms and civilians line quietly for food permits. Their war unfolded through tone, hesitation, memory, and careful phrasing as much as through gunfire. And perhaps that is why their story lingers differently after the noise fades. Because translation resists easy separation between human beings. The interpreters learned this slowly across years of war. Language carried fear too clearly. Hunger too clearly. Homesickness too clearly. Even enemies remained recognizable once their voices passed through familiar words shaped by mothers, grandparents, weather, food, childhood streets, and ordinary longing. In the careful way certain words were spoken or avoided entirely. Some rarely discussed the war until old age. Others never fully did. Yet even unspoken memory leaves shape behind it. Children notice pauses. Grandchildren inherit photographs. Archives preserve voices once carried through static across entire oceans. And still the rain continues falling softly across the harbor tonight. A train moves somewhere beyond the warehouses. Windows glow briefly inside distant apartment buildings before darkening one by one. Ordinary life settles into sleep across the city while the water keeps shifting beneath the docks exactly as it did during the years when troop ships crossed west carrying young interpreters toward a war that would divide memory permanently into before and after. Perhaps that is the quiet truth left behind by their story. Not that war transforms people suddenly, but that repetition does. Rain after rain. Translation after translation. Voice after voice emerging from darkness until human beings begin carrying entire histories internally without fully realizing when the weight became permanent. The interpreters entered the Pacific as young men asked to prove belonging through language.